I have said this before, but when it comes to trying to explaining economics or even economic concepts to like a general public audience who in most cases does not have a good or even a basic understanding of economics and sometimes what it can mean when we talk about figures as we talked about yesterday in the Pacific Partnership video. It's only going to grow the British economy by 0.04% up to um, you know, 2035 or something like that. But that small figure represents, you know, thousands of pounds. I don't even say millions because I'm not even really sure what, to be honest, that might actually represent. But economics can sometimes be a really difficult process to try and explain to a general population. And bear in mind, I'm not an economist, I'm not an expert in these things. But I do try and listen as much as I can to other experts. And someone who is actually really good, who I would love to talk to at one point about this, because I think he has a lot of really good ideas when it comes to like reaching out and talking about economics to a general population and trying to educate them on economics and sometimes what it means is unlearning economics. He's really good at what he does. But I do agree that when it comes to, or at least when you go online or things like this, you can see economists arguing about the slightest percentage points or sometimes concepts that you've got no idea what they're talking about. But I recognize it. I play a lot of Paradox big grand strategy games. And if you go on the Paradox forums, you will see discussions take place about what minor percentage points you want to try and achieve for the country that you are playing, because this, advisor that maybe gives like 0.10% to your uh, global trade strategy is really good for the long term as long as he's alive. But if you had this guy or you managed to achieve this minor percentage point, it's actually better than the advisor who you are spending gold for in the long run. Honestly, it's I'm really into those games, but even me trying to maybe explain why maybe you don't want that advisor and maybe want to sort of foster other things in your economy by spending powerpoints, building markets, or at least trade hubs in the right towns and areas that you control. Honestly, it would be just be Greek, and that's what it is sometimes, trying to get across the idea to the general populace what economics is and why and sometimes it can be so important. And Brexit is a classic example of this, because the Brexiteers sold Brexit as this is going to be the balm to all the UK's problems. We're going to be having, sunshine and rainbows from now on, now that we've left Brexit. And yet you've got the budget of the Office for Budget Responsibility saying that if we had remained in the EU, our economy would be 4% better. And when I say, someone to 4%, to you and I, that doesn't sound like a lot. So a lot of the Brexiteers just go, oh, that's just 4%. That's nothing. But in the grand scheme of things, that can represent billions of pounds in the economy that can be spent on things like education, the NHS, in infrastructure. This is why, you know, basic, I think, economic literacy, and I think that a lot of economists really, really do fail to reach out to a general audience. They're almost stuck in this academic realm. And if you sort of try to, dip your toes into that academic realm, you'll very quickly find yourself in conversations or seeing conversations or even reading blogs or things like that, and concepts that are really difficult for someone with no economic background or anything like that to try and understand. So certainly I always recommend unlearning economics. He's really good at what he does. Um, like I say, I would love to have a conversation with him. But someone else who is, I think, also quite good at trying to get across economic concepts to a general audience, William Keegan in The Guardian, and he is really good at this. And as we were talking about Brexit, a lot of Brexiteers refuse to even accept the reality of why we entered into the European economic area as it was, and why Margaret Thatcher created, helped to create the single market, and why you have all these Eurosceptics who were sort of confused and bamboozled that Margaret Thatcher would even join or even help create something like the single market, because they were like on a complete deregulation train. But they ignore entirely like the economic sort of history of the UK, where we were prior to that, known as the sick man of Europe, mostly because after decolonization and going in from the 60s to the 70s, our entire economy was still based on this imperial preference system. The idea that we would just extract everything we need from the colonies, it would come here, be made here, and then we could sell it back to the colonies, because the colonies weren't allowed to trade with anyone else. We had these captive markets. But now decolonization has come in. The British economy can't act like that anymore. And there was just this almost refusal to accept the times and change with it and make the necessary changes to do that. There was no real good business investment. And of course, then you get onto Margaret Thatcher, who goes, we're going to deregulate everything. And of course, when you deregulate stuff, of course, you're going to see a bump. We got that bump. But sooner or later, that bump can only last so long. And in your long term, deregulation doesn't overwhelmingly tend to be that good an effect. And of course, we are living still with a lot of those consequences of the deindustrialization that she performed, and of course, the deregulation effects that were unleashed on the economy, which eventually led to the problems that we saw in the 2008 financial crash. And one of the things is that I've talked about before is the Edinburgh reforms that Rishi Sunak has recently sort of, tried to sneak in. And the best way to just try and describe this to you and to sort of, people who aren't, economically literate is I've described it as effectively what Rishi Sunak has done is remove the seatbelts from the UK economy. And by doing that, he is essentially assured that sooner or later, if the UK economy is involved in some sort of crash, it's going to be bad. Because what happens when you remove seatbelts from a car? It is a safety feature. If you remove that safety feature from a car, what happens? What happens? And it's not a case that, the driver of the UK economy gets into that accident. It's someone else might, as everyone is well aware, sometimes car accidents, you can just be, stopped at a traffic light and all of a sudden someone runs straight back into the back of your car. There are economic shocks that we cannot predict or forecast, or that can happen in another country, just as they did in the 2008 financial crash, which can ripple across and affect our own economy. And without those seatbelts, those economic crashes all of a sudden become just that bit worse. And this is what has how happened. This is what is becoming very clear with Brexit, that the economic promises that were spun by the Brexiteers and their insistence that in reality, what we really wanted to go to was this free market fundamentalist approach to our economy, this crazy libertarian ideas that we saw unleashed by Liz Truss and the disaster that very quickly followed. Many conservatives are still obsessed with that idea. They want to go down those routes. And the problem is that you've got to try and explain to the British public why going that way is bad. Now, of course, you've got the perfect example of Liz Truss. Even if you do this happens. And Liz Truss and those economic ideas are going to be the way. But the further we get away from trust, the less people will remember, the less people will understand, or maybe they change tact and start explaining it in a different, more sneaky way. Well, we've got to start explaining, well, this is what would happen, this is what the consequences would be. And this is when, the economists should be able to step in and start to explain, especially to the general public, what those consequences would be and what the economy really needs to sort of get moving. But even then, um, economists, will fight like, two cats in a sack about differing economic ideas, just as two grand paradox players would argue over which advisor is the best for EU4. Um, so, um, it swings and roundabouts sometimes when it comes to these things. But of course, just like all economists, they all have their own thoughts, ideas, and what they would, sort of want to do. So there's never really almost a unanimous agreement between them. But that's just economics. That's how it works. But there is also economic consensus as well. Um, we talked about the Institute of Economic Affairs putting out this whole grand paper about how fantastic, quote, Brexit trade had been, and then every single major economist in the UK starts ripping into them for these for putting out this. So there is tends to be proper economic consensus at many points. So as always, um like I say, beware when you hear people talk about sort of economics, because sometimes trying to explain that 0.4% or the oh well it was our economy is only 4% worse off, we'll be fine. Jacob Rees-Mogg will be fine in 50 years time. Well, what about now? What about between then and 2050? I meant to just wait because we've seen what happens when we've had a government this year who have effectively just done nothing in order to try and bring down inflation. They've just, crossed their fingers and in the hopes that it would go down. But there you go. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.